this is the kind of subject which can arouse polemics, passions, but we need to have a sober-minded approach to this question. And it is an important question in the international class struggle. And before I go into it, we have to make clear that we abhor anti-Semitism and racism in all its forms. We reject any kind of prejudice based on a person's color of skin, language, religion, etc. We also support the right of the Palestinian people to a homeland, something they've been struggling for the past 75 years. And we must make it clear that in the present scenario, the oppressed people here are the Palestinians, who have been denied a homeland. Many of them have been expelled, living in refugee camps, living outside their homeland. Others are living in their historical homeland, but oppressed under the jackboot of the Israeli state. Now, as Marxists, we have a duty to offer a solution, which, from our point of view, must be class-based. We must look at the class contradictions. It must be internationalist, and it needs a socialist perspective. We do not believe there is a solution outside of a socialist perspective. I also speak as a Marxist, not as a nationalist of any kind. The only thing you can accuse me of is that I like spaghetti and pizza. But that's not really a class question, or maybe some people think it is, I don't know. It's not always easy to grasp a Marxist position on a question like this, but I think that after 75 years of terrible suffering, different methods that have been tried by the Palestinian people, all of which have failed to achieve a homeland. The most recent one, the illusion that the Palestinian Authority was somehow a step towards a homeland, has been dashed by experience. The truth of the matter is, all right, yeah. The truth is that they've never been further from having a homeland and a territory for themselves. And I will go into that in a minute. Now, Marxists fight for defend the right of both peoples, Jews and the Palestinians, to live in this land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, with the right of return to their homeland of the Palestinians, with all of them living equal, complete equality in the law, but not just in law, equality also in living conditions, etc. But we believe that on a capitalist basis, this cannot be achieved. A capitalist Israel will continue to oppress the Palestinians. It's in the interests of the ruling class of Israel for that to be the case. Now, we're not just Marxists, we're also Trotskyists. I know some people on the left don't like that, but there are different left currents. We are clearly and unbrazenly Trotskyist and defend the tradition of Leon Trotsky. Trotsky wrote a few things on this question, and he wrote back in the 30s. I'll just quote one of his texts, when he refers to the fact that a nation cannot normally exist without a common territory, and Zionism springs from this very idea. But he also says that Zionism is incapable of resolving the Jewish question, i.e. it doesn't solve the question of anti-Semitism and the oppression of Jews. That continues to be the case, even though a section of the Jewish population now lives in what is historically Palestine. And he was referring to the situation in the 30s, where he said the conflict between the Jews and Arabs in Palestine acquires a more and more tragic and more menacing character. And he says, I do not at all believe that the Jewish question can be resolved within the framework of rotting capitalism. He also highlights the dangers that Jews were facing in that period with the spread of fascism, the threat of fascism in several countries, and with that, a direct threat to the Jews. And he actually touches on an article in 1938. He says, even without war, he's talking about the prospect of a world war, the next development of world reaction signifies with certainty, and he highlights this, the physical extermination of the Jews. This was Trotsky in 1938. I could go further, but as we saw, tragically, that is what happened. I'll go back to that in a minute. Now, the problem that we have in Israel, Palestine, is the maneuvers of the imperialists over the past century or so. If we go back to 1917, there was the Balfour Declaration of the British government, which was a statement for support of, quote, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. So in 1917, in the Balfour Declaration, they promised that land to the Jews. But only a year earlier, in May 1916, in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was signed secret agreement between the British and the French, with the support of Tsarist Russia and the support of the Kingdom of Italy, as it was then, it was an agreement over spheres of influence, in particular, what they planned to do to the land of the Ottoman Empire, as they expected they would defeat in war, they would break up in war, and who would take what. And Britain was to receive Palestine, Jordan, South Iraq. In this, they said that Palestine would be internationalized. France was to get Syria, Lebanon, and parts of Turkey. This secret agreement was published in November 1917 by the Bolsheviks when they came to power, because the Tsarist regime had signed the agreement and they just made it public, showing what they were up to. Now, prior to the Sykes-Picot, shortly before that, the British had promised Arab independence to the Arab people in exchange for an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire. You see how imperialists exploit peoples for their own interest, promising them they would grant them something when it is in their interest. Once they've achieved that interest, of course, they can very easily change position. The Americans recently did it with the Kurds of Syria. You know, when they were fighting their enemy of the moment, it was only of that moment, of course, ISIS, the Kurds were useful. Once they were no longer useful, they forget about the Kurds. And they've done that with one people after another in history. So part of the problem we have in the Middle East, it lies on the shoulders of the imperialists, the British, the French, later on the Americans, and others. Now, fast forward to, and then I will move back and forwards in time here. The Palestinian Authority, which was established, which is still there on paper, has become a corrupt authority. Most Palestinians consider it corrupt, and I've even seen opinion polls which show that a majority would even declare it would make no difference if it collapsed. This is the reality of the situation. And since Israel agreed to the Palestinian Authority being set up, they have been pumping more and more settlers into the West Bank, backed by the Israeli state, the Israeli army. These settlers are armed, and now we've reached the staggering figure of 700,000 settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This is a continuing crime against the Palestinian people. And we have to look at how can we offer a way out of this on a class basis. Now, going back to the origins, what created the conditions for the realization of what was really the dream of a tiny minority of Jews? The idea of creating a homeland in Palestine. Well, what created those conditions was centuries of anti-Jewish pogroms, killings, discrimination, etc. But in particular, what really pushed it forward was the terrible experience under the Nazi regime of Hitler, which changed the situation dramatically. Now, it wasn't just Hitler, of course. The Tsarist regime, the nice Tsars, which are presented as these nice people by some of them, they used anti-Semitism regularly and promoted pogroms, killing thousands of Jews and contributing to this scenario. Now, I don't want to go into the details of all that. It's a historically recorded fact that this was the case. Now, just to clarify, what was the position of the communists, of the Bolsheviks? Lenin, in a speech, which is actually a recorded gramophone speech of Lenin, one of the few that you can get, from 1919, it's on YouTube, he says this: "It is not the Jews who are the enemies of the toilers, i.e. of the workers. The enemies of the workers are the capitalists of all lands." And he highlights, you know, there are Jewish workers, they are our brothers in the struggle for the same cause, i.e. the transformation of society. The Bolsheviks had a complete opposition to anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, with the rise of Stalinism, many things changed. Yesterday I talked about the family and how there was regression on the family front, such as the abolition of abortion, etc. But also on this question, anti-Semitism made a return under the Stalinist regime. That explains why so many Jews over the years have attempted to leave, or even in the previous period, leave Stalinist Russia and escape that atmosphere. Sorry, I'm going to skip forward. As I said, before the terrible events of the 1930s in Germany and the 40s in the Second World War, the idea of emigrating to Israel had little real attraction for most Jews in Russia, Eastern Europe, and other countries. After 1881, there was a small trickle of Jews to Palestine, but between 1881 and 1914, under the impact of the anti-Semitic pogroms, millions of Jews left Tsarist Russia and Eastern Europe. About 2.4 million of them left that part of the world. But where did they go? 85% went to the United States. 12% went to other countries, mainly Canada, Argentina, Western Europe, and South Africa. These are the kind of countries they were emigrating to. To this day, there are more Jews in North America than there are in Israel proper. Less than 3% went to Palestine. And of these, many of them saw it as a temporary stopover on their way to other destinations. This meant that this very small inflow of Jews was not sufficient to sustain a sort of programmed, systematic Jewish settlement. In fact, many of the Jews of Eastern Russia and Eastern Europe, as one book I'm quoting here says that substantial numbers of Eastern European Jews turned to socialism, which promised the eradication of anti-Semitism and full equality through radical social transformation. You just need to look at the Bolshevik Party and you'll see it. The number of Jews that were in the Bolshevik Party, even leading figures. Trotsky himself was of a Jewish background, but he wasn't the only one. That was the perspective. On the basis of the perspective of class struggle and revolution, Many Jews looked to socialism, i.e. solving their problems within the countries they were living in as part of the class struggle, which would end class oppression and with it the oppression of minorities. But of course, the Russian Revolution was isolated. Stalinism came to power. The revolutionary wave of the post-First World War period was defeated in one country after another. And then we had periods of black reaction, fascism in Italy, the Nazis in Germany, the Franco rising in Spain, and other such examples. That pushed back the perspective of socialism and the class struggle. So let's see what happened in terms of the population in what was to become Israel, which was cut out of historical Palestine. In 1800, in this territory, there were 7,000 Jews, but there were 246 Muslims, i.e. the Arabs, the Palestinians mainly. In 1890, there were 43,000 Jews, but 432,000 Muslims. In 1914, 94,000 Jews, 525,000 Muslims. In 1931, 175,000 Jews and 760,000 Muslims. In 1947, when Israel is about to be set up, there were 630,000 Jews. You see this massive influx of Jews from different parts, mainly from Europe, but there were still twice as many Palestinians. 1,181,000 Palestinians. Still, 2/3 of the population was still Muslim. There were also Christians and other peoples there. Now, this was the balance. How then did this change? Well, 1948, May the 14th, Nakba, as the Palestinians call it, Israel declares independence. This led to a war, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and I'll explain in a minute, under the threat of terror, killings, bombings, 700,000 Palestinians fled from the territory, massively reducing, obviously, more than half the population, and 600,000 Jews fled the Arab countries during the war, and they fled to Israel. So you have a massive ethnic displacement of two peoples and a massive change in the balance. Now, the British were not too keen on an independent Palestine with a majority of Jews. A lot of people don't realize that this was the case. When the question was put to the United Nations, whereas the US and the Soviet Union voted in favor of the creation of Israel, the British abstained. You might find that, one, the Soviet Union, the myth that the left, so-called socialist country, they voted in favor of the creation of Israel. And the Americans were doing that too. This was in the context of British imperialism in decline, losing its spheres of influence, being pushed out by the Americans. These are supposed to be friendly countries. They both speak the same, more or less, same language. And the Americans were the rising power, taking over spheres of influence and pushing the British out. And the Soviet Union did it for the same reason, to hit at the British. And they voted in favor. Now, the British, their real aims were not to create a Jewish or a Palestinian majority, but to create an ethnic balance within the country. This is the method the British imperialists have used around the world. In Northern Ireland, they did it, and you see the consequences there, where we had 30 years of troubles and thousands of people killed. They did it in Cyprus, the balance between the Turkish and the Greek-speaking population, which led to war in the 70s. The crime they committed in India with partition, the way they set up several colonies, such as Nigeria, a balance between Muslims and Christians, different ethnic. This was the divide and rule method of British imperialism, i.e. they knew they had to leave the colonies, they like to leave them divided internally, ethnically, in order to control from outside. But of course, the Jewish people that are concentrated now in the territory, they were there to establish a new country, Israel. They armed, there were organizations such as the Irgun, which is a Jewish paramilitary organization, later absorbed into the Israeli Defense Forces. They were also responsible for the tragic massacre at Deir Yassin in April 1948, where 120 Jewish fighters killed over 100 Palestinians in that village of 600. The consequences of such a policy, you can imagine, terrorizing the Palestinians and pushing them out. It was a policy of terror, and many fled, as I said, ending with the 700,000 fleeing. The irony of history, of course, is that Irgun was considered a terrorist organization by the United Nations, by the British, and even the US at that time. Irgun also had a political predecessor of the right-wing Henut Freedom Party, which later became the Likud, which is Netanyahu's party. So that's the historical roots of his party. And there was also the Haganah, the main military force. This had the involvement of Menachem Begin, who was the premier of Israel 1977 to 81, founder of the Likud, a leader of the Irgun, who fought the British and also took part in the terrorizing of Palestinians. Now, when Israel was created and the United Nations voted to grant the territory they did to the Jewish population, the Palestinian Arabs still accounted for 70% of the population, and they owned 92% of the land. But they were allocated only 47% of the country in UN Resolution 181. This was a clear crime, i.e. expropriating a people. That's what happened. Now, that was the crime, historically speaking. It was carried out. You cannot achieve national liberation of any people when you oppress another people. I will quote Engels on that in a minute. Fast forward a little bit to the 60s. We have the creation of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, founded in 1964, promoted by a number of Arab states. A component of that was Fatah, under Yasser Arafat, from the late 50s, who then came to dominate the PLO by the end of the 60s. In the early days, they promoted guerrilla tactics, individual terrorist tactics, which, if we look at it historically, achieved nothing. It actually was also quite skillfully used by the Zionists to portray the Arabs as wanting to destroy and kill the Jews. Now, that's a very strong element in the consciousness of the Jewish people, considering their history. It was the PLO, based in Jordan after 1967, and prior to the Black September of 1970. To this day, this is an important element. Around 3 million Palestinians are living in Jordan, of around 11 million population. Some speculate there could be more. Now, there's an important event that took place in September 1970, which has gone down in history as the Black September, where the Jordanian army came into conflict with the PLO fighters in Jordan, crushed them, killed several thousand Palestinians, and pushed the PLO out. Now, this is an element which I think as Marxists we should look at, because if the PLO had not been based on a nationalist, basically capitalist-based policy, but had been a revolutionary socialist organization, they could have provided a leadership to the Jordanian working class in its struggles against the monarchy. Instead, the PLO attempted to assassinate the king, but never attempted to create a mass movement inside Jordan. Had they provided that leadership, there was the prospect of overthrowing the Jordanian monarchy with a working class movement, a socialist movement, and you could have established a socialist Jordan, a workers' Jordan. that would have dramatically changed the balance of forces of the Palestinians on the West Bank. And a class-based solution could have been found in that struggle. But of course, that was not to be. The PLO were expelled, pushed to relocate to South Lebanon, which eventually led to the civil war in Lebanon in 1975, and the PLO being expelled once more, shifting its headquarters to Tunisia. Now, in all these movements, you see the guerrilla tactics achieved nothing. Because we have to accept the fact Israel exists, and it's a very powerful capitalist state. It has a very powerful military, apart from the fact that it's also got nuclear weapons. Everybody knows that. They wouldn't be too useful in the West Bank, because I wouldn't want to be a person living in Tel Aviv if a bomb dropped, an atom bomb ever dropped on the West Bank. It's more long range, I suppose. Iran is seen as the threat to Israel. But nonetheless, it's a powerful military machine with the backing of US imperialism. If the cards were ever, if they were ever at risk, you can count on the US backing Israel in this. And because of the historical animosity now that's been built up, because of the fear they've inculcated in the population of Israel that they are under threat from the Arabs, you have, at this moment, quite a reactionary situation inside Israel, with the bulk of the population voting for one or other Zionist party. So how do you break this down? That's the question. Now, as I said, it has to be based on class politics. The leadership of the Palestinians should adopt a socialist perspective. Instead, we've seen it, the PLO is one thing, but within it, there have been left organizations that claim to be socialists. Some of them even claim to be Marxist-Leninist. But at a certain point, they adopted the classic position, which stems from Stalinism, by the way. Put the class struggle to one side, because the immediate task is national liberation. If you adopt that position, it means national liberation of the workers, the poor of the Palestinians, with the Palestinian bourgeois. That's what it means. And we think that's actually weakened the cause of the Palestinians, not strengthened it. Fast forward again to the first Intifada of 1987, which actually started back in '86 with mass youth protests. This movement was a genuine mass movement from below in the Palestinian territories, which was not promoted by the PLO, whose leaders did not believe that mass actions of this kind were possible, and therefore the Intifada was actually led by community councils, and it was in effect, they call it a non-violent mass protest. I mean, throwing stones, I suppose, is not non-violence, but they didn't have the weapons that the Israeli army had. And yet this powerful mass movement of people, clearly showing they didn't want Israel occupying their land, shocked even sections of the Israeli military. I'm talking about rank and file level. Such was the power of this movement that it led to the phenomenon, for instance, of refuseniks, Jewish soldiers refusing to serve outside of Israel in the occupied territories. And the first Intifada went on from 1987 to 91. There was a second in 2000, 2005. Now, what were the combined effects of this mass movement? It had a big impact on consciousness globally, highlighting the Palestinian situation, but even had an effect on sections of society in Israel. Just to go back a little bit, when the Palestinian headquarters were moved to South Lebanon, Israel occupied South Lebanon for a period. And in that period, we had, in 1982, the terrible massacre of Sabra and Shatila, the camps where Palestinians were butchered by the Christian phalange, right-wing phalange. They reckon up to 2,000 Palestinians may have been killed. including women and children. In Israel, this provoked a reaction amongst the population. On the 26th of September 1982, there was a demonstration in Tel Aviv of 400,000 people. That highlights how certain there were elements that could indicate the possibility of a breakdown of Israel along class lines. Now, as I said, the Intifada sent a clear message. The masses were prepared to fight, to mobilize, and it had this impact. It was this mass movement from below that was eventually to lead to the Oslo Agreement and the setting up of the Palestinian Authority, which on paper seemed to give a semblance of statehood, i.e. this is the beginning of a process that could lead to a Palestinian homeland. But that was false. We as Marxists always understood that. We said this is not the perspective. It remained under overall control of Israel. Israel had the control of military and the outside borders. Now, the PLO went from a previous position of not recognizing Israel in the early days, guerrilla tactics, individual terrorist tactics. In 1993, they flipped, they recognized the right of Israel to exist, and they collaborated in setting up the Palestinian Authority. Now, what was the Palestinian Authority really about? Well, the fact is this. The Intifada showed that if there's a mass mobilization of the Palestinians, the Israeli forces cannot police the Palestinian people if they have risen up. The Palestinian Authority was in reality a means of getting Palestinians to police Palestinians for Israel. That's the reality of the situation. And it's not the first or the last time we see this method. Look at Northern Ireland. The IRA and Sinn Féin, considered terrorists, did carry out terrorist bombings in Ireland and in Britain. Suddenly, the British imperialists negotiate with them. They bring them on board into government to pacify the situation in Northern Ireland. In Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, who were former guerrillas, are brought into government and used to govern the country for the capitalists. And what about the ANC in South Africa? The ANC were considered terrorists. When the movement of the black working class was so powerful that they could not stop it, they had to govern in a different way. They released Mandela and they brought the ANC into government, and they even promoted a few individual black South Africans to become capitalists, black ministers, etc., to show the black people of South Africa that now we have equality because we have all the colours now in the government. In practice, the social economic conditions for the majority of people didn't change, but for years the capitalist class has governed South Africa through the ANC. So it's not peculiar to Palestine, this method of using the leaders, let's say, of the oppressed people to hold down the oppressed people. This is an intelligent move that the capitalists have always used. Now, I have opinion polls here, as I said, that show that, here's a title from the Middle East Eye. The title is Palestinians Furious and Fed Up with Corruption of Abbas's Mafia PA. This is from a couple of years back. And it says that I think it's like 91% consider the Palestinian Authority to be corrupt. They're stashing money away. They've got their nice houses outside of Palestine in case anything should go bad. And they have no real concern for their own people. We have the situation in the West Bank, which is like this, and we also have it in Gaza. Gaza, a particular development where, with the losing of the authority of the PA leaders of Fatah, the PLO, Hamas emerged as a force in Gaza and was able to take over back in 2006-07, and they fraternally expelled all the Fatah officials in Gaza. and Gaza was mostly, for a long period, closed off as a result. But the social economic conditions are atrocious. Unemployment in Gaza is over 50%. The population is living in terrible poverty. And in Gaza, while they shoot small rockets over the border, which achieve nothing, they are de facto policing that territory also, just as the others are in the West Bank. Now, this leaves the Palestinians divided territorially. They were before, but now they are also politically. In many ways, those who live in the West Bank, those who live in Gaza, the historical Palestinians who stayed in Israel proper and are citizens of Israel, but also the Palestinians who live in Jordan and other countries. Now, the terrible economic conditions I could highlight, which I got the figures somewhere here, and also what is happening to these peoples. The bombings, the regular bombings of Gaza, the killings of Palestinians, several times in the last few years. Of course, if you denounce all this is just a parenthesis. If you denounce any of this, you're immediately tainted as being anti-Semitic. And it's not anti-Semitic to denounce a government which is oppressing a people. And it's not racist to point out the oppression of a people. You're just telling the truth. And we should not accept these accusations, which are used now in the labour movement to accuse anybody that is on the left. And think about it, anybody that's genuinely on the left is going to sympathise for the Palestinians and the plight of the Palestinians. They will be condemned as anti-Semitic. We reject that completely. More recently, we've seen the killings and the attacks on Palestinian territory. A report just from the 14th of May refers to an attack on Gaza where at least 33 Palestinians were killed. So it's not just a few years ago, it's ongoing. As I said, Gaza's unemployment rate, the last figure I have here is 55%. This was in 2018. But 80% of Gaza's nearly 2 million people depend on humanitarian aid because it's not a proper functioning economy because of this. At the same time, the settlers are expanding ever more into Palestinian territory. For example, during 2017 and the first 8 months of 2018, just as one example, Israeli authorities approved plans for over 10,000 housing units in West Bank settlements, excluding East Jerusalem. They issued over nearly 6,000 tenders as compared to approving plans for over 4,600 units, etc., etc. At the same time, they destroyed 390 Palestinian homes and other property, forcibly displacing 407 people. This was just in 2017-18. This is going on all the time. Not just that. Back in 2018, they passed the what is called the Jewish nation-state law, which further reduced the rights of the Palestinians inside Israel, i.e. Israeli citizens. They were already discriminated. This officialized that status in law. And then we have the hypocrisy of the Europeans, the democratic Europeans. Just to quote, I'm quoting somebody from the EU. It says, how Israel chooses to define itself is an internal issue for Israel to decide. And we value Israel's commitment to the shared values of democracy and human rights, which has characterized our long-standing and fruitful relations. It almost makes me cry reading this understanding of democracy. What kind of democracy is it? Because they've always claimed to be the only true democracy in the Middle East. What kind of a democracy is it? Yes, internally within the borders of historical Israel, of Israel proper, recognized as Israel the state. You have bourgeois democracy, you have elections and the voting for parliaments. Yes, in that sense, it's a pure bourgeois democracy. But what about the people who live in the West Bank and live in Gaza? And what about the second-class citizens which you've demoted within Israel? It's a rather strange concept of democracy. But what's been happening, you can't really see it from here, but this is a map of the West Bank. And it goes from 1970, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, 2016. If you can see it, the patches get darker and darker and more and more. Those are the settlements taking place. Here I have a graph, settled population in the West Bank, only in the West Bank, excluding East Jerusalem, from 1980 to about 2012. I don't think I need to describe and that is only half, more or less, of what we have now. This has been ongoing because the Zionist project is not just to be happy with what the United Nations gave the Jewish population back in the 40s. There is an extreme wing of Zionism that has, their policy is, finish the job. I can quote one of them later on. I.e., we should finish what Ben-Gurion didn't finish in the 40s, which is expel all the Palestinians. And some of them, they say, there is a homeland for the Palestinians. It's called Jordan. That's what they say. And it's not just the Palestinians of the West Bank, also the Palestinians who live in Israel itself. But you see, Israel also is a class-divided society. For example, I'll give some figures. It is one of the most unequal countries of the 34 OECD countries. And 60% of the poor in Israel are working. They're working poor. In 2016, they gave figures that 21% were living below the poverty line, when the average for the OECD was 11%. But let's look at some of the figures. Over 67% of national assets in Israel are in the hands of the richest 10%. You can get similar figures for almost any capitalist country. And as I said, it's one of the most unequal of the capitalist countries. In 2021, they calculated that 1.9 million were living below the poverty line. That makes 23% of Israeli citizens. Now, there are some contradictory figures. It might not be quite as high, but there's at least 15, 16%, even on the more conservative calculations. But among the Jewish population of Israel, it's 17%. Among the Arab population of Israel, it's 36%, which highlights the greater inequality even within Israel itself. Compare this, however, to Gaza, where the most recent poverty rate figures show 65% living below the poverty line. In the West Bank, they calculate it could be up to 30%. And overall, the average rate of poverty in both Gaza and the West Bank, excluding the settlers, obviously, is about 40%. So, these are clear figures. The oppressed people are the Palestinians, but there's also a layer of the Jewish working class, which is living in poverty conditions. And this actually brings home to me a famous quote from Engels, which I want to give. He wrote a text in 1874, and it's called A Polish Proclamation. And it's interesting to read what he says. He says this: a people which oppresses another cannot emancipate itself. The power which it uses to suppress the other finally always turns against itself. This is a message to the Jewish working class of Israel, by the way. And he adds, this was in, obviously, Russia and Poland. He says, as long as Russian soldiers remain in Poland, the Russian people cannot free itself either politically or socially. I think this can be applied to any country in the world where one people is oppressing another people. The poor of Israel will never be emancipated if they participate in the national oppression of the Palestinians as a people. Now, some people say, well, where are the prospects for class struggle in Israel? At the moment, it's an extremely reactionary situation. We have to admit that. But you see, we have to look beyond the borders of Israel-Palestine and look at the whole region. In 2011, we had the Arab Spring. How many times have you been told, if you're a Marxist, that you really believe it's all going to happen at the same time? in every country on Monday morning at 9 o'clock? That's the usual story we get. Well, I'm sorry to say, the Arab Spring, it did happen at the same time. And it started in one country and spread very quickly to the others. Tunisia sparked the Egyptian revolution. And then you had movements in Jordan and other countries. Who can question that if in Egypt, in 2011, there had been a strong Marxist organization, a workers' party with a Marxist leadership, the Egyptian working class could have taken power in Egypt and in Tunisia. That would have changed the whole process in the Middle East. Imagine before I referred to Jordan, can you imagine 80 million plus, half the Arab population lives in Egypt, by the way, this powerful working class taking power, a socialist Egypt, a workers' Egypt, bordering Gaza. That would massively change the balance of forces in favor of the Palestinians. But you see, it wasn't just that it was an all-Arab movement, which unfortunately was lost because of lack of leadership. In the middle of all this, in August 2011, 400,000 people were on the streets of the cities of Israel. And they were Jewish people protesting. What were they protesting over? They weren't protesting in solidarity with the Arab people. Let's not confuse this. But they were protesting about social issues in Israel, things like housing, etc. This is what it says, I quote from this article from the New York Times, "The protest began over the lack of affordable housing, but grew to encompass calls for tax reform and the creation of a welfare state, among other demands." I mean, these are social issues. There you have an example. Imagine in that moment, if the workers had come to power in Tunisia and Egypt, spread to Jordan, Lebanon. We've seen the powerful movement there, but also the potential for barbarism in Lebanon. If it had gone in the direction of a socialist transformation, you could have had an impact on Israel proper and massively shifted the balance of forces, and then you'd have the perspective of a possibility of a solution to the Palestinian problem. Instead, that of course didn't happen, and we have the continuing reactionary situation in Israel. Netanyahu leaning ever more to the right. He has an interest, of course, in staying in office because of his own personal problems. He likes to send other people to prison. He doesn't like the idea of him going to prison. But he's leaning on the far right political groupings in Israel, amongst which there are some rabid reactionaries, which I could quote in a minute. But this is going on at the same time as the settlers are increasing all the time. As I said, now there are 700,000 settlers in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. I remember when I would be giving a lead-off on this just a few years ago, and it was always 200, 250,000, which is already a problem. This is massively increasing, and it's going to grow. And they're armed, they're backed by the state. Curiously, they don't even live in Israel, but they are made Israeli citizens, and they can vote in the elections. Strange democracy, bourgeois democracy, where some of the electorate is living as a minority, an armed minority, within an oppressed majority. But that's bourgeois democracy. You can take it or leave it. That is what has been happening. I'll try and fast forward on this. So what is the way out of this situation? I think I've just underlined it. A socialist perspective is required. Now, the Arab Spring of 2011 is not going to be the last time the masses of the Middle East have risen up. We are living in a world situation where class struggle is on the agenda everywhere, even in your nice little calm Canada, which some people emigrate to and think it's a paradise compared to where they live, and compared to Afghanistan or Pakistan or many African countries, that's what it must look like. But of course, we know there are class contradictions in Canada. Otherwise, how do you explain the Kupi strike and the other strikes, even the threat of illegal strikes in Canada, all the unionization campaigns in the United States? Further south, look at the movement in Peru, both the positive and the negative aspects of that movement. Look at the movements in Africa, Sudan, the marvellous revolutionary upsurge, and now this terrible reactionary barbarism that we have there. And the movements in Europe, in the heart of Europe. Look at France, that gives you the prospect of class struggle. It's a global perspective of class struggle because of the crisis of capitalism. Therefore, in this context, the perspective of a renewed upsurge of struggles across the Arab world is not a fantasy. It's not a dream. It's a reality. Movements like the one we saw in Sri Lanka, where they just took everything over but had no leadership and therefore failed, will take place again and again. Now, in this context, the slogan for the Socialist Federation of the Middle East is not a utopian slogan, it's a concrete slogan, and within the prospect of a Socialist Federation of the Middle East, which means states controlled by the working class, worker states under democratic control of the working class, you can raise the perspective of a socialist Palestine and Israel. One country for two people living together in peace with not just full democratic rights. It's not enough to have democratic rights if you're unemployed and don't have a house. There's not much. I remember in Nigeria when the military dictatorship collapsed in the end of the 90s, when democracy was brought in, some people were saying, is it something you can eat? Which is more important in that context. You could see a unified one state for all the peoples with two official languages, which would be Hebrew and Arabic, the right of Jews and Muslims to, or non-Jews and non-Muslims, or Muslims who are not religious, etc., all the peoples to live in freedom and to have other rights, housing, welfare, education. All that requires resources to achieve it. But we can present that prospect as a possible future. And Lenin used to say that the national question at the end of the day is the question of bread. If you can give all the peoples a safe homeland, good housing for everybody, jobs with decent pay for everybody, good pensions, retiring not too late in life like they want to do everywhere in the world, you could envisage a generation or two after which the historical animosity would start to recede and people could genuinely live in peace together. That could never happen under capitalism, but it could happen under a socialist economy and a socialist federation. Now, some might say, that's all very good, but we have to do something now. That's always the answer. Well, the doing something now has been done for 75 years, and it has not achieved any movement in the direction of a homeland for the Palestinians. On the contrary, they are facing the worst situation since they were first expelled. If you look at the map of the West Bank, it gets broken up and broken up, occupied, taken over. They're fragmenting. They're carrying out the project of these extreme Zionists. And one of them, I just want to quote, where is he? Our friend Smotrich, who is an ultra-reactionary Zionist, and he's a leader of one of the parties that makes up the coalition government of Netanyahu, the religious Zionist party. He's a settler in the West Bank. He's opposed to Palestinian statehood, but he's famously said in one speech, he referred to a mistake that Ben Gurion didn't finish the job and didn't throw you out in 1948. He is in this government. He's also known for commenting on gay pride parades as being worse than bestiality. These are the types of people that Netanyahu is leaning on. And at the moment, it is true to say that the situation in Israel is an extremely reactionary one, with the bulk of voters voting for right-wing Zionist parties to one degree or another. The historical left in Israel has been massively weakened. But we have to offer the perspective of class struggle, which is not easy in the context in we're in, but we can present an internationalist perspective the perspective of the struggle of the peoples of the Middle East coming to power with working class power, and the expropriation of the resources and the use of these resources for the good of the peoples of all the region. In that context, you can imagine a homeland for the Palestinians and the right of Palestinians to return. And we believe as Marxists that although it may seem far away, it is the only realistic option open to the peoples of this region.